The security guards didn't even look me in the eye when they dropped my life into a soggy cardboard box. It was raining on Fifth Avenue, a miserable, freezing sleet that turned the limestone facade of Vance Architectural Holdings into a blurred gray monument. My mother stood under a massive black golf umbrella, her pristine beige trench coat completely dry. She didn't look down at me. She looked through me, her manicured hand resting casually on the tailored shoulder of my younger sister, Cynthia. "You brought this on yourself, Evelyn," my mother said, her voice smooth like polished marble and just as cold. "Did you really think we wouldn't find out about the bleeding hearts? You've been funding under our name? You're stripped of your title. You're stripped of your shares. Effective immediately, you are persona non grata in this family and this firm." A crowd of junior associates had gathered at the revolving glass doors, their eyes glued to the scene. These were people I had managed, people I had mentored. Now they were watching me get discarded like trash on the sidewalk. Cynthia offered a small, venomous smile, leaning into our mother's side. "Don't worry, Evie," Cynthia whispered loud enough for the guards to hear. "I'll take real good care of your office. The view from the top floor belongs to a true Vance anyway." My chest burned. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing the air straight out of my lungs as the rain soaked through my blazer, ruining the silk blouse I'd bought to celebrate what was supposed to be my promotion day. I looked at the box in my arms, a cheap ceramic mug, a desk calendar, and a framed photo of my late father. They thought they had stripped me bare. They thought they had taken everything that gave me power. But as my mother turned her back on me and walked into the warmth of the skyscraper, guided by the very board members who had signed my exile, my fingers tightened around the wet cardboard. They didn't know about the safety deposit box in Delaware. They didn't know what Dad whispered to me the night before his heart failed. They thought they had just evicted an employee, but they had actually just unlocked a vault. The dripping faucet in my studio apartment counted the seconds like a countdown timer. I sat on the edge of a mattress that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's lavender detergent, staring at the wet photograph of my father. David Vance had been a titan, a visionary who built Vance Architectural Holdings from a 2-room office in Chicago into an empire that redefined the Manhattan skyline. But to me, he was just the man who smelled of sawdust and peppermint, the man who stayed up late to help me build scale models out of balsa wood while my mother and Cynthia attended charity galas. My mother, Victoria, never forgave me for being like him. She wanted a daughter she could mold into a high society trophy, a carbon copy of herself to parade around the Hamptons. Cynthia fit the bill perfectly. I, on the other hand, preferred construction sites to country clubs. When Dad died 3 years ago, the light went out in our family home, replaced by an aggressive, suffocating greed. Victoria and Cynthia immediately moved to sanitize his legacy, cutting the community, housing projects he loved, and pivoting toward ultra-luxury, high-rises that maximize profit while displacing communities. Every time I argued in the boardroom, Victoria would silence me with a look that reminded me I was outnumbered. "Your father was a dreamer, Evelyn," she'd sneer, swirling her scotch. "Dreamers go bankrupt. We survive." They had spent the last 3 years slowly eroding my authority, sidelining my designs, and poisoning the board against me. I had tolerated the snubs, the rewritten meeting minutes, and the quiet exclusions from family dinners because I believed I was protecting Dad's dream. I thought if I worked harder, if I brought in bigger clients, they would finally see my value. But sitting in the damp cold of this apartment, looking at the bruise on my arm from where the security guard had grabbed me, the scales fell from my eyes. They hadn't just sidelined me, they had systematically targeted me, and they thought they had won because they held the majority shares of the parent company. They forgot one crucial detail. My father knew exactly who his wife and youngest daughter were. I stood up, walked to my closet, and pulled out an old leather duffel bag. Hidden beneath the false bottom was a rusted brass key with a tracking number, stamped into the metal. It belonged to a private vault in a small, independent bank 3 hours outside the city, a bank my mother didn't even know existed. Dad had given it to me during his final week in the hospital, his voice a breathless rasp as he pressed it into my palm. "When the house of cards starts to fall, Evie, you go to Delaware. Don't look back." I held the key tightly, feeling the cold metal bite into my skin. Tomorrow, I would make the drive. But as I reached for my phone to check the train schedules, an alert flashed across the screen. It was a press release from Vance Architectural Holdings. Already live on Forbes. Vance Holdings announces departure of Evelyn Vance following internal audit involving financial irregularities. They weren't just firing me. They were destroying my professional name so completely that I would never work in this industry again. My phone began to vibrate violently with incoming calls from colleagues and reporters. I turned it off, the silence of the room heavier than before. They wanted a war, and they thought I was weaponless. As I lay down on the bare mattress, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling, I realized the first crack in their perfect facade was already forming, and they didn't even hear it. The drive to Wilmington, Delaware was a blur of gray asphalt and torrential rain. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my dented sedan so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every highway sign felt like a mile marker drawing me further away from the only life I had ever known, but closer to whatever survival Dad had buried for me. The bank was an unassuming brick building squeezed between a dry cleaner and a defunct bakery. It lacked the towering marble pillars of the Manhattan institutions my mother frequented, which was exactly why Dad chose it. I walked inside, the smell of old paper and damp wool filling my nose as I presented the rusted brass key in my identification to a gray-haired clerk who looked like he had been sitting behind his mahogany desk since the 1980s. He didn't blink at the name Vance. He just nodded slowly, led me down a narrow flight of concrete stairs into a dimly lit basement vault, and left me alone with a long, heavy steel deposit box. When I lifted the lid, my heart slammed against my ribs. I expected cash, maybe some jewelry, or original blueprints to our earliest properties. Instead, the box was entirely filled with thick, blue-bound legal portfolios and a handwritten letter from my father inside a sealed wax envelope. I tore the envelope open, my eyes scanning his familiar, messy script. Evie, if you are reading this, Victoria has taken the firm. I tried to build safeguards. But your mother's ambition is a parasite that eats everything it touches. What you are holding is the deed to the ground beneath her feet. When I restructured Vance Holdings 20 years ago, Victoria insisted on owning 90% of the corporation. I gave it to her. But she never looked at the land leases. I purchased the physical earth under our top 5 Manhattan skyscrapers through a private land trust named after your grandmother. The trust belongs entirely to you. Victoria owns the concrete, the steel, and the glass. But you own the dirt. And the ground leases expire this year. A breathless, hysterical laugh escaped my throat. In the commercial real estate world, owning a building meant nothing if you didn't control the ground it sat on. If the land lease expired and wasn't renewed, the building owner either had to buy the land at market value, pay astronomical rent, or forfeit the structure entirely. I pulled out the contract for the Fifth Avenue flagship tower, the very building I had been thrown out of yesterday. The ground lease was set to expire in exactly 60 days. The renewal terms required unanimous consent from the land trust's sole trustee. I packed the documents into my duffel bag, my hands shaking not from fear, but from a sudden, roaring rush of adrenaline. Victoria and Cynthia had spent years making me feel small, treating me like an unwanted employee in my own family. They thought they had left me with nothing but a cardboard box of office trash. As I walked out of the bank and into the cold afternoon air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number, but I recognized the casual cruelty instantly. Hope you like the apartment, Evie. Mom and I just cleared out your old office. We're throwing your drafting table in the dumpster where it belongs. Don't show your face in the city again. I stared at the screen, a cold smile spreading across my face. I didn't reply. I got into my car, turned the key in the ignition, and pointed the hood back toward New York. They wanted me out of their sight, but I was about to become the very ground they walked on. I didn't go back to my studio apartment. Instead, I drove straight to a small diner in Queens where the smell of grease and burnt coffee served as a shield against the high society world I had just been ejected from. I spread the blue-bound legal portfolios across the cracked vinyl booth, my eyes devouring the dense legalese. Dad hadn't just left me the land leases. He had left me a roadmap as I dug deeper into the financial addendums of the Grandmother Trust. I found a secondary folder marked Project Horizon. Horizon was the flagship luxury residential skyscraper, currently under construction in Hudson Yards. It was Victoria's crown jewel, the project she and Cynthia were using to secure a massive $50 million credit line from a syndicate of international banks. According to the documents, the land beneath Project Horizon didn't belong to the city, and it didn't belong to Vance Holdings. It belonged to the trust. But as I flipped to the current corporate filings on my laptop, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Victoria had filed a certified affidavit with the city planning board stating that Vance Holdings held a 99-year unrestricted title to the land. She had forged my father's signature on a retroactive transfer deed dated 2 months before his death. My hands began to shake as I compared the signature on the city filing with the original deeds in my possession. It was a flawless forgery to the untrained eye, but Dad always signed his middle initial with a slight, distinct loop that connected to the last letter, a habit he formed after a wrist injury in his 20s. The forgery didn't have it. Victoria had committed outright bank fraud and grand larceny to secure her funding. She had built her entire empire on a foundation of quicksand, completely confident that I would never find out because she had spent a decade convincing me I was incompetent. Suddenly, the diner door swung open, the bell jingling loudly. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, their eyes scanning the booths until they locked onto me. They walked over with a deliberate, intimidating stride, stopping right at the edge of my table. One of them pulled a badge from his pocket. Private security? My mother's personal fixers, Evelyn Vance, the taller one said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening murmur. Your mother requested we retrieve certain corporate assets you took from the office. You have 10 seconds to hand over the duffel bag, or we make a call to the NYPD regarding those financial irregularities your company discovered. They thought I would panic. They thought the threat of jail would make a 29-year-old girl crumble. I slowly closed the portfolio, sliding it into my bag, and looked up at them with a calm I didn't know I possessed. Go ahead and call them, I said, leaning back against the vinyl. Tell them to bring the fraud division. Because if you touch this bag, the next person I call is the federal prosecutor handling the Hudson Yards banking syndicate. Let's see whose handcuffs fit better. The 2 men exchanged a brief, uneasy glance. They weren't prepared for me to fight back. The taller one opened his mouth to speak, but his earpiece buzzed. He listened for a moment, his expression hardening, before lowering his hand. This isn't over. Evelyn, he muttered, turning on his heel. They walked out into the rain, leaving me alone in the booth. My mother was already panicking. She knew I had gone to Delaware, and she knew the clock was ticking. I zipped the bag tight, a fierce fire burning in my chest. They had just given me the confirmation I needed. The first crack in their perfect lie had appeared, and I was going to hammer it until the whole structure came crashing down. By midnight, the rain had turned into a thick, suffocating fog that swallowed the city skyline. I sat in my dark studio apartment, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the walls. My mother's private security team had backed off for the night, but I knew Victoria wouldn't stop. She was a predator who smelled blood, completely unaware that the blood was her own. I logged into the SEC database using an old secondary administrator credential I'd created during my first year at the firm, one Victoria's IT department had neglected to scrub. What I saw on the screen made my jaw drop. Vance Architectural Holdings wasn't just looking for a credit line. They were hemorrhaging cash. Victoria and Cynthia had spent the last 18 months living like royalty on the company's dime, purchasing a multi-million-dollar estate in Palm Beach and funding Cynthia's failed fashion line through subsidiary marketing expenses. To cover the massive deficit, they had quietly begun liquidating the company's mid-tier real estate portfolio, selling off affordable housing units Dad had spent his life protecting, but the real shocker was a private board resolution filed just 3 days ago. Victoria was planning a massive public buyout. A shell company owned entirely by her and Cynthia was going to buy out the remaining public shareholders at pennies on the dollar, taking the company private and securing absolute control before the Hudson Yards. Project went public. It was a golden parachute for them and a complete execution for me. If they took the company private, my remaining diluted shares would be legally erased, and any internal records of Victoria's forgery would be permanently locked behind corporate privacy laws. They were going to finalize the buyout at the upcoming Centennial Gala in 6 days. Suddenly, my phone rang. The screen displayed a contact I hadn't expected to see. Marcus Vance, my father's estranged younger brother and a minority board member. who had been exiled to the West Coast office. Years ago, I picked it up, my voice steady. Marcus? Evelyn. His voice was strained, thick with anxiety. I just saw the board minutes for the privatization vote. Victoria told us you were skimming from the charity fund, that you confessed and ran. But I know your handwriting. Evie, and I know your father's. I just saw the title. Deed she submitted? For the Hudson Yards project. It's a fake, isn't it? My heart leaped. She forged Dad's signature, Marcus. I have the original land deeds right in front of me. The ground leases for the top 5 buildings expire in less than 2 months. She doesn't own the dirt. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Marcus inhaling sharply. My God! She's leveraged the entire corporate infrastructure against land she doesn't own. If the banks find out, they'll call the loans immediately. The firm will collapse by morning. Then we don't let the banks find out, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. Not yet. We let her think she's winning. We let her host her grand gala. I want her to stand on that stage in front of every investor, every politician, and every camera in New York City. Evelyn? That's suicide, Marcus warned. If she signs those privatization papers on stage, the legal window to contest the fraud closes. She'll have the absolute right to seal the records. She won't sign them. I replied, staring at my reflection in the dark window pane. Because before she can lift the pen, I'm going to pull the earth right out from under her feet. I hung up before he could argue. I had 5 days to prepare the legal paperwork, coordinate with the land trust's attorneys, and ensure every major media outlet in the tri-state area had a front-row seat to the execution of Victoria Vance's legacy. They thought they had left me drowning in a sinking ship, but they didn't realize I was the one who held the keys to the lifeboats. For the next 48 hours, my studio apartment transformed into a war room. The floor was buried under decades of land surveys, property tax receipts, and certified bank disclosures. I survived on black coffee and adrenaline, working alongside Arthur Pendleton, my father's retired general counsel. Arthur was 72, with sharp blue eyes and a deep-seated loathing for how Victoria had dismantled my father's life's work. It's a masterpiece of corporate trap-setting, Evelyn, Arthur murmured, adjusting his reading glasses as he stamped a stack of legal injunctions. Your father didn't just protect you, he built a kill switch. By refusing to renew the ground leases, you technically force an automatic reversion of the physical structures to the landowner. In 60 days, you don't just own the dirt, you own the skyscrapers sitting on them. And the forgery on the Hudson Yards property? I asked, pinning a copy of the fraudulent deed to my wall. That is the criminal lever, Arthur said, his voice hardening. The moment we file the title dispute with the New York Supreme Court, the state attorney general will be legally required to freeze all construction. The international banking syndicate will automatically trigger their default clauses. Victoria's shell company won't just fail to buy the firm, she will be personally liable for $500 million in accelerated debt. While Arthur finalized the lawsuits, I began building my public shield. I knew Victoria's playbook. She would try to paint me as a disgruntled, unstable former employee who stole corporate secrets. I needed a counter-narrative that she couldn't suppress. I contacted Maya Lin, an investigative real estate journalist for the New York Times who had been trying to pierce the opaque wall of Vance Holdings' finances for years. We met in a crowded subway station in Brooklyn, completely out of sight of my mother's private security, when I handed her the copies of the forged signatures and the independent forensic audit Arthur had compiled. Her eyes widened. Evelyn, this isn't just a corporate coup. This is a systemic financial fraud that could destabilize the entire Manhattan luxury market. If I run this, your family will come after you with everything they have. Let them, I said, my voice steady and unyielding. But they won't have time to sue for libel. Because the story drops the exact second my mother takes the microphone at the Centennial Gala. Maya looked at me for a long moment, seeing the determination etched into my face before nodding slowly. The editors will want the originals verified by Friday morning. If they check out, we'll have the digital front page ready to go live at 9 p.m. on Saturday. That night, I finally slept for more than 2 hours. For the first time since being thrown out onto Fifth Avenue, the crushing weight of humiliation was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. The next morning, a heavy, cream-colored envelope was slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a VIP ticket to the Vance Holdings Centennial Gala, accompanied by a typed note from Cynthia. We heard you've been lurking around the city. Evie, Mom wanted to make sure you had a front row seat to see what a real legacy looks like. Dress code is black tie. Try not to ruin the photos. I held the heavy cardstock, a low laugh escaping my lips. They were so blinded by their arrogance, so completely certain of their absolute power, that they were literally inviting their executioner into the room. I looked at the black dress hanging in my closet, the one I had bought with my own money, intending to wear it to my promotion dinner. I smiled. It was going to look perfect under the ballroom lights. The Plaza Hotel was a fortress of gold, white roses, and flashing cameras. A massive banner hung across the grand ballroom entrance, reading "A Century of Elegance, Vance Architectural Holdings." The air hummed with the chatter of Manhattan's elite, politicians, billionaires, and real estate moguls all sipping champagne while a string quartet played a frantic, upbeat Vivaldi. I stepped out of the rideshare, pulling my black trench coat tightly around my silk dress. My heart was a hammer against my ribs, but my face was masks of pure ice. In my silver clutch, alongside my phone and lipstick, sat a flash drive containing the file stamps of the 5 emergency land reversion injunctions Arthur had quietly processed in court. Just 2 hours before the clerks closed for the weekend, I handed my ticket to the velvet rope usher. He checked the list, his eyes widening slightly as he saw my name, but my VIP credential was undeniable. "Welcome, Ms. Vance," he murmured, unhooking the rope. As I walked into the ballroom, the crowd seemed to part. Word of my firing and the alleged financial irregularities had circulated through the rumor mill, and the whispers started almost instantly. "Is that her? I thought she was banned. Look at her face. She has some nerve showing up." I ignored them, keeping my chin high as I spotted Victoria and Cynthia standing near the stage, surrounded by the lead directors of the International Banking Syndicate. My mother looked radiant in a deep emerald gown, diamond emeralds dripping from her neck. Cynthia was next to her, giggling as she poured champagne into the glass of a major investor. Suddenly, Cynthia's eyes locked onto mine. Her smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. She nudged our mother, whispering furiously into her ear. Victoria turned slowly, her icy blue eyes narrowing as she locked onto me. She excused herself from the bankers, walking toward me with a slow, predatory stride that she usually reserved for hostile takeovers. Cynthia trailed closely behind her, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. "You have exactly 30 seconds to turn around and walk out of here." "Evelyn!" Victoria hissed, her voice a lethal low vibration. "I don't know how you got past security, but I will have you dragged out in handcuffs in front of the mayor if you make a scene." "I'm not here to make a scene, Mother," I said, my voice completely smooth, devoid of any anger. "I'm just here to celebrate Dad's legacy. After all, 29 years of my life went into this company too." "You don't have a company anymore, Evie," Cynthia sneered, stepping into my personal space, her breath smelling of expensive wine. "In 20 minutes, Mom is signing the privatization papers. Your remaining stock options are going to be legally dissolved, and your name will be permanently scrubbed from the building registry." "You're nothing but a ghost." "A ghost," I repeated, looking from Cynthia to Victoria. I looked past them, seeing the massive mahogany signing table on the stage, where the heavy leather portfolios of the buyout agreement sat waiting under a spotlight. "Well, you should know, Mother. Ghosts are very good at haunting the houses you think you own." Victoria leaned in, her eyes burning with an arrogance that bordered on madness. "You are weak, Evelyn. Just like your father. He built this empire, but he didn't have the stomach to rule it. I do. Enjoy the show from the back of the room. It's the closest you'll ever get to power again." They turned their backs on me, walking toward the stage as the master of ceremonies took the microphone, announcing that the privatization signing ceremony was about to begin. I looked at my watch. It was 8:45 p.m., the countdown had officially begun. In exactly 15 minutes, Maya Lynn's front page expose would go live, and Arthur's legal servers would release the court documents directly to the banking syndicate's legal team. Took a deep breath, walking toward the center of the room, right into the front row. I wanted to make sure they could see my face when the foundation under their feet completely disintegrated. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat into the microphone, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, please take your seats. We are about to witness a historic moment for Vance Architectural Holdings. The room grew quiet as the city's elite shifted toward the stage. Victoria ascended the stairs first, her emerald dress catching the light, her posture radiating absolute victory. Cynthia followed a step behind, her chin held high as she scanned the crowd, her eyes locking onto mine with a smug, triumphant sneer. They took their places behind the massive mahogany table. Under the bright spotlights, the heavy leather-bound privatization portfolios looked like holy scripture. I remained standing at the very front of the ballroom, right by the velvet rope, completely motionless. My hands were folded over my silver clutch. To anyone watching, I was the defeated daughter, forced to witness her own professional execution. Tonight, we don't just celebrate 100 years of architectural excellence, Victoria began, her voice smooth and practiced as she addressed the crowd. We look forward to a bold new chapter. By taking Vance Holdings private, we are streamlining our vision, securing our legacy, and ensuring that our premier projects, like the magnificent Project Horizon and Hudson Yards, remain under the singular, unyielding vision of the Vance family. A polite round of applause rippled through the room. Victoria smiled, basking in the adoration, completely unaware that behind her, near the backstage entrance, a slight commotion was starting. I looked down at my watch. 8:55 p.m., 5 minutes left. I saw Arthur Pendleton slip into the back of the ballroom, accompanied by a man wearing a city marshal's badge and holding a thick, water-resistant courier pouch. Arthur caught my eye from across the crowded room and gave a single, solemn nod. The digital filings were complete. The court system had officially recognized the land reversion injunctions. On stage, Victoria reached for the heavy Mont Blanc pen resting on the holder. I want to thank our international banking partners, who have shown absolute faith in our expansion, she said, nodding toward the front row table where the lead syndicate directors sat smiling. With this signature, we secure our independence. Just as her fingers touched the pen, a sharp ping resonated through the room. Then another, and another. Within 5 seconds, a chorus of digital chimes, vibrations, and ringtones began echoing across the ballroom. It started with the junior associates near the doors. But like a wave of electricity, it rolled forward. I watched the lead director of the banking syndicate pull a sleek smartphone from his tuxedo pocket. His brow furrowed instantly as he read the screen. Cynthia noticed the sudden distraction in the crowd, her smile wavering as she leaned over to whisper to our mother. Victoria paused, her hand hovering inches above the contract. She looked out at the audience, her eyes tightening as she saw dozens of people simultaneously staring down at their screens, their faces draining of color. The investigative piece had just dropped. The headline on the front page of the New York Times digital edition was clear, bold and devastating. Vance Holdings facing collapse, forgery, fraud, and $500 land reversion claims threaten Manhattan real estate giant. The lead director suddenly stood up from his table, his chair scraping loudly against the parquet floor. His phone was already pressed to his ear, his face white with rage as he stared directly at Victoria on the stage. Victoria tried to maintain her composure, her voice cracking slightly as she leaned into the microphone. If everyone could please silence their devices, we will proceed with the... Victoria! The director barked, interrupting her completely. The entire ballroom went dead silent, the string quartet freezing mid-note. Do not sign that paper. My legal team just received an emergency injunction. Who owns the land under Fifth Avenue? The deck chairs were officially sliding, and the iceberg was right in front of them.
The silence in the grand ballroom was suffocating. Victoria stood frozen on the stage, the Mont Blanc pen suspended in her hand like a useless piece of plastic. The bright spotlights, which had highlighted her victory seconds ago, now felt like an interrogation lamp. What is the meaning of this, Thomas? Victoria said, her voice cracking as she tried to force a laugh through the microphone. We own the flagship property. We own the entire corporation. This is a ridiculous interruption. You own the concrete. Victoria, Thomas, the lead syndicate director, shouted from the front row, his voice echoing off the gold leaf ceiling. He held up his tablet, his face contorted in a mixture of panic and fury. My legal counsel just pulled the New York Supreme Court emergency docket. A land trust has filed 5 separate reversion claims. The ground leases on your top 5 revenue-generating properties expired, and the trustee has denied renewal. The banks are pulling the $50 million credit line for Hudson Yards effective immediately. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Billionaires and city officials looked at each other in utter shock, quickly backing away from the stage as if Victoria were contagious. Cynthia's face went completely pale, her hands trembling as she grabbed her mother's arm. "Mom, what is he talking about? What land trust? Dad left everything to us." "She's lying," Victoria roared into the microphone, her polished facade completely fracturing as she pointed a manicured finger at Thomas. "This is a bureaucratic mistake. My husband signed over all land titles to the parent company before he died." "No, he didn't, Mother," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it cut through the air like a razor. I unhooked the velvet rope and walked slowly up the carpeted stairs of the stage. Every eye in New York high society locked onto me. The cameras that had been hired to capture a corporate triumph were now flashing frantically in my face. Victoria stared at me, her eyes widening with a sudden, sickening realization. "Evelyn, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything but read my father's will," I said, stopping exactly at the opposite end of the mahogany table. I opened my silver clutch, pulled out the certified court filings, and slammed them down onto the leather portfolio she had been about to sign. "The land trust belongs to me. Dad bought the dirt beneath your feet 20 years ago through an independent entity."
You threw me out of the building on Fifth Avenue, completely unaware that you were standing on my property. "You ungrateful little brat," Victoria hissed, stepping away from the microphone so the crowd couldn't hear, her teeth bared like a cornered animal. "I am your mother. I will have our lawyers tie you up in court until you are penniless. You have no proof of anything." "I have the original deeds," I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, steady whisper that radiated absolute authority. "And more importantly, I have the original signatures. I know you forged Dad's name on the retroactive transfer deed for Project Horizon. Mother. The New York State Attorney General's Fraud Division was notified an hour ago." "Arthur?" At the back of the room, Arthur Pendleton signaled the city marshal. The marshal walked down the center aisle, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, holding a certified federal warrant. Cynthia let out a sharp, hysterical sob, dropping her champagne glass. It shattered on the stage floor, the expensive liquid soaking into the hem of her designer gown. "Mom, do something! Tell them she's lying!" But Victoria couldn't speak. She looked out at the crowd of her peers, the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, the people she had stepped on to reach the top. They were all staring at her with disgust, recording her downfall on their phones. Thomas turned away from the stage, signaling his associates. "The syndicate is calling the loans. Secure the assets before the state freezes the accounts. Vance Holdings is done." The empire hadn't just cracked. The sovereign foundation had completely collapsed, and Victoria was left holding a pen that could no longer write her way out of ruin. The flashing blue and red lights of the state police cruisers cast long, rhythmic shadows against the marble pillars of the Plaza Hotel. The crowd of Manhattan's elite had scattered like roaches, leaving only a handful of reporters shouting questions from behind the barricades. I stood on the top step of the entrance, wrapped in my black trench coat, watching the final act play out. 2 plainclothes investigators escorted my mother down the stairs. Victoria's emerald gown was crumpled, and her hands were cuffed behind her back. For the first time in my life, she didn't look like a titan. She looked small, defeated, and incredibly old. Cynthia followed closely behind, weeping hysterically into the coat of a public defender, her designer shoes slipping on the wet concrete. As Victoria reached the bottom step, she stopped, turning her head to look back up at me. Her icy blue eyes were bloodshot, filled with a desperate, burning resentment. "You destroyed your own family, Evelyn," she rasped, her voice trembling. "You destroyed your father's name." "No, Mother," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the crisp night air. "Dad destroyed his company the day he gave you the power to corrupt it. I just saved the foundation." She opened her mouth to speak, but the investigator firmly guided her into the back of the waiting sedan. The door slammed shut and the car pulled away into the New York traffic, taking the remnants of Victoria Vance's tyrannical reign with it. 3 months later, The dust had finally settled. Vance Architectural Holdings was gone, liquidated to pay off the massive fraud debts incurred by my mother and sister. Victoria was currently serving a 7-year sentence in a federal facility for bank fraud and grand larceny, while Cynthia had moved to a small town in Ohio, living off a court-mandated stipend and completely blacklisted from high society. But from the ashes of the old empire, a new structure had risen. I sat in my new office, located on the top floor of the Fifth Avenue flagship skyscraper. The heavy, dark mahogany furniture my mother insisted on had been replaced with light oak, open spaces, and large blueprints of affordable housing projects across Brooklyn and Queens. The brass plate on the glass door read, Vance Land and Architecture. Arthur Pendleton walked inside, a warm smile wrinkling his eyes as he placed a fresh cup of coffee on my desk. The board of the new trust just finalized the acquisition of the Hudson Yard site, Evelyn. We own it outright now. No debts, no syndicates, no lies. And the community center designs? I asked, looking up from my drafting table. Approved unanimously, Arthur said softly. Your father would be incredibly proud, Evie. You didn't just build a business. You built a sanctuary. After Arthur left, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant expanse of New York City. The rain had stopped, and the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, bathing the limestone skyscrapers in a brilliant, golden light. I picked up the small, framed photograph of my father that had survived the soggy cardboard box 3 months ago. I set it gently on the center of my desk, right next to the original land deeds. They thought they could humiliate me, discard me, and erase my name from the world my father built. But they forgot that concrete cracks and steel rusts. The only thing that truly lasts is the earth beneath it, and the truth you use to defend it. I smiled, looking back out at the horizon. The ground was firm, the foundation was mine, and for the first time in my life, I was finally standing on my own 2 feet.